This is London. It's the capital city of the United Kingdom and one of the richest cities in the world, with an economy worth more than $500 billion. Meaning that if it were a country, it would have the 26th largest economy in the world, roughly the same size as Norway's. And for nearly 2 centuries, both in Britain and Europe, it's been a hub for high-value services like finance, offering some of the highest wages in the region. But behind its displays of vast wealth lies a very different picture. In 2023, London's councils estimated that more than 1 in 50 people in the city are homeless. This is a figure which has risen by more than 50% in just 10 years, which means Britain now has by far the highest level of homelessness in the developed world. All this while real wages, that is what people take home after accounting for inflation, have remained flat for over 15 years. This means people are being paid roughly the same as they were in 2008, while the prices of almost all goods and services have increased, and essentials like housing have skyrocketed. It's therefore no wonder that people are beginning to leave the UK at an unprecedented rate. A junior professional could earn more than double in New York compared to London, with the cost of living only around 1/3 higher. Because of this, every year, more and more of Britain's young, skilled workers leave the country for a better life elsewhere. Particularly from Britain's famed National Health Service, which is facing a potential exodus of doctors and nurses due to poor pay, overwork, and deteriorating working conditions. People flooding out of the UK is perhaps a good metaphor for the current state of the British economy. And ironically, more people from outside the UK are immigrating to work in Britain each year than ever before. Whilst it's true that the primary reason of migration is to use the UK's world-leading education services, research conducted in 2015 found that those leaving the country were significantly more skilled than those entering the nation each year, stating that increases in net migration over the last decade have significantly increased the pool of low-skilled workers in Britain's economy. Offsetting skilled workers with less skilled workers is not good for any country, as it ultimately means lower productivity and a poorer quality of goods and services that are offered within the economy. So why could it be that a seemingly wealthy country like Britain is seeing a mass exodus of some of its most talented and youngest workers? Part of it has to do with living standards in the UK becoming worse and worse each year. In fact, this was the main reason given by Britons leaving the country. And this makes sense, as if you remove London's output and population, it would shave off 14% from British living standards, making the remaining UK perform worse economically than Mississippi, the lowest ranking US state in terms of per capita economic performance. This all ties into a growing theme that the UK's best days are behind it, and one which is also supported by the data. In 2007, the average UK household was just 8% worse off than its peers in northwestern Europe, but in the 15 years that has followed, this gap has grown to a record 20%. On present trends, the average Slovenian household will be better off than its British counterpart by 2024, and the average Polish family will achieve the same feat by the end of the decade. And these stagnant wages is a burden which is being disproportionately felt by those with lower incomes. While the UK's top earners rank 5th for living standards, the average household ranks 12th and the poorest 5% rank 15th. Far from simply losing touch with their Western European peers, last year, the lowest earning bracket of British households had a standard of living that was 20% weaker than their counterparts in Slovenia. This is part of a growing paradox, that as more and more people move to the UK, its levels of public services and pools of skilled workers are gradually declining. So let's take a look at why this is happening to one of the richest countries in the world, and why everyone suddenly wants to leave the United Kingdom. Before we start, I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Enquiries. If you use the internet as much as me, then your data will have ended up all around the web when you make online purchases or create accounts. And what's worse is that there are data brokers who are collecting, analysing, and selling your data to buyers all over the planet. Which is a problem because when so many organisations are passing around your data, it makes it easier for someone to sneak in and steal it. I've had my data stolen in the past, and trust me, it's not fun. It involves a lot of time and endless hassle trying to fix it. There are specific websites where people can directly find your information, and all someone needs to do is input your name and get access to sensitive information such as your address, phone numbers, employment, and even information on your children. And while these services make promises not to use them for things such as stalking or harassment, there's little that they can do to enforce that, which is why Incogni is such an important service, as it reaches out to these data brokers and on your behalf requests your personal data to be removed and deals with any objection from their side. This process is 100% automated, and all you have to do is create an account and grant them access to work on your behalf, and then kick back and watch as your data disappears from the web. It really is that easy, and all you need to do is visit incogni.com/invisiblehand and use the code InvisibleHand at checkout to get 60% off an annual plan. Check the link in the description to get started. It wasn't that long ago that Britain was one of the most prosperous and attractive destinations for young skilled talent in the world. A feeling which is shared by many Britons too. A recent poll found that 60% of respondents view life as being better in the 1990s and 2000s than today. This era in particular is looked back upon with nostalgia for many British people. Music from bands like Oasis and the Spice Girls were worldwide hits, as the Cool Britannia movement swept the country, and the end of the Cold War was also adding to a global sense of optimism. Of course, there is always a tendency for people to view the world of the past favourably, but the 1990s stand out in particular as they were a period of real economic success for Great Britain. Despite a rocky start to the decade, marked by the turmoil caused from the fallout by the ERM and a recession in the early 1990s, the UK entered an era of remarkable economic resilience. From 1992 onward, Britain enjoyed its longest stretch of uninterrupted growth since the Second World War, driven by a combination of structural reforms, effective monetary policies, and favourable global conditions. This period, often referred to as the Long Expansion, was characterised by continuous GDP growth and significant productivity improvements. The financial sector played a pivotal role in this economic success, with substantial credit expansion, particularly in property lending, driving consumer spending and investment. Regulatory change also made the UK an attractive place to invest, meaning the UK retained a positive balance of net income from abroad. However, in this decade, Britain continued to shift towards a more service-based model of employment, and while prosperous, it did not provide the broad-based employment that the industrial sector had, causing widespread job losses in areas like heavy industry and mining, jobs which tended to be located in poorer areas of the country, away from cities like London. The UK continued to grow in this period. However, midway through the 2000s, a number of problems were starting to appear, and the financial crisis of 2008 exposed and exacerbated these underlying weaknesses in Britain's economic model, revealing an over-reliance on financial services and a lack of adequate investment in other vital sectors. Today, the nation grapples with a number of severe issues, including an overstretched NHS, a housing affordability crisis, and ageing infrastructure, all of which stem from past policies and require urgent attention to secure a sustainable future. Perhaps the most important issue for people living in the UK right now is that of housing. Not only are there not enough homes, but ones which exist have become unaffordable for the vast majority of the population. This has made home ownership for first-time buyers nearly impossible without an income far above the average, or financial support from the so-called bank of mum and dad. And this shouldn't come as a surprise. The UK has consistently built fewer homes compared to the needs of its growing population, especially when compared to other developing countries. This shortfall is largely due to restrictive planning laws, limited government funding for public housing, and a prioritisation of other economic areas over residential construction. Over the decades, the cumulative effect of not building enough homes has led to a significant supply-demand imbalance in the housing market. This is an issue which has its roots in policies of the past. Introduced in the late 1970s, the Right to Buy scheme allowed tenants in public housing to purchase their homes at a discount. At the time, this policy was seen as really progressive, as it made home ownership achievable for those who before could only have dreamt of it. And while this policy enabled many people to own a property, it also led to a substantial reduction in the stock of social housing. And since these homes were not replaced at a sufficient rate, the social housing sector shrunk by about 25% since the 1970s, all while the population has continued to increase. With fewer social homes available and ongoing challenges in housing affordability, more individuals and families have turned to the private rental sector. This increased demand has naturally led to rising rents, as the supply has not adequately kept pace with the demand. Rising rental costs have disproportionately affected those on lower incomes, who find fewer affordable options available and usually need to compete on price for what they can afford. And what makes all this worse is that house prices have continued to outstrip real wages for well over 30 years, creating an even bigger difference in society between those who own their homes and those who don't. Housing supply is of course an issue across a number of Western European economies, however it's particularly bad in the UK. In England, there are now 1.4 million fewer households in social housing than in 1980, all while the UK's Gini coefficient, a measure of inequality, has been steadily rising. This has led to overcrowding, both in the private sector and in social housing. And what this means is that on an unprecedented scale, more and more households are being pushed into homelessness, but one which is less visible to the broader public: temporary housing. After declining for several years, the number of English households living in temporary accommodation has more than doubled between 2010 and 2023, from 48,000 to 112,000, the highest figure since records begun. Conditions in these buildings are often atrocious. Damp and mould are commonplace, as are insects and animal infestations. The disruption of being moved from place to place like this causes adults to drop out of work and children out of school, further decreasing social mobility, as those unfortunate enough to live in these conditions are even less likely to earn a higher income in the future. These arrangements also impose enormous cost on local councils, which last year spent almost 1.8 billion on emergency shelter, a figure that has more than doubled in real terms over the past decade. This nightmare scenario is due to three main factors: woefully inadequate rates of house building, a dwindling social housing sector, and the erosion of financial support for those unable to afford market rents. And these issues aren't likely to get any better soon, as shifts in the UK housing market have disproportionately disadvantaged the youth. A significant portion of older individuals own a second home, whereas young adults today are far less likely to own even a single home and are far more likely to rent. This change reflects broader economic trends, where stagnant wages contrast with soaring asset values, exacerbating wealth disparities. The slower economic growth also means fewer opportunities to advance your career, impacting earnings, especially during critical early stages. In the UK, it used to be the case that you could expect to earn more or have a better economic outlook than your parents. However, this trend looks to have died, as those born in the 1980s have generally earned less by their early 30s compared to the previous generation. Unable to afford a home, and with dwindling wages, it's no wonder that some of the UK's most talented individuals are leaving for other countries like the US, Australia and New Zealand, which offer a quality of life more appealing for ambitious and productive British workers. Stagnant wages are of course a major factor in this, and this is largely thanks to dwindling productivity across the country. Productivity is the efficiency with which a nation produces goods and services from its inputs, labour and capital. And since the financial crisis of 2008, the UK has faced a stark slowdown in productivity growth. Before the crisis, productivity was growing at around 2% annually. However, after the crisis, this growth has nearly flatlined, and notably there have been a significant decrease in investment. Since 2005, UK companies have invested 20% less than their counterparts in the US, France and Germany, placing Britain in the bottom 10% of OECD countries. This underinvestment has resulted in outdated technology and equipment, reduced innovation, and a shortfall in skill development across both industrial and service sectors. And consequently, the overall efficiency and innovative capacity of the UK economy has suffered, leading to slower productivity growth. And nowhere is this clearer than with the UK's National Health Service. The National Health Service, or NHS, was established in 1948 as a publicly funded health service that was free at the point of access. Since its introduction over 70 years ago, the NHS has become a staple of British life, and something which is taken for granted by many people. However, as time has gone on, and especially in the last 2 decades, costs have started to spiral as the quality of treatment and care provided has declined. This is partly because when it was first introduced, Britain's population was significantly smaller and also much younger, meaning fewer people required healthcare and treatment. But even as taxes have risen over the last decade to record levels, public services like the NHS are struggling even more than ever. The number of people waiting for NHS consultant treatment has more than doubled from 3 million to 7.4 million in the 9 years after 2014. And data consistently indicates that patients treated by the NHS for major health issues such as heart disease, strokes or cancer have lower survival rates compared to those receiving treatment in most other developed nations. And in 2014, the UK had below average survival rates for the deadliest cancers, including the lowest rates among comparable nations for colon and pancreatic cancers. It would be easy to assume that the failure of this service is from years of underfunding. Whilst this is partly true, the NHS has seen a significant increase in funding and staffing levels since 2019. And in 2023, NHS funding was 11% higher in real terms than it was in the previous 4 years. Additionally, the number of senior doctors has risen by 9%, and there are 8% more nurses and health visitors, even after adjusting for higher staff sickness absences. So, what's the problem? Despite more funding and more staff, the NHS faces rising costs due to several factors. An ageing population requires more medical care, new medical technologies and treatments are expensive, and drug prices are increasing, all while people are expecting higher quality medical care. And in the last few years, as inflation has run rampant, staff are expecting higher wages, which also adds to the cost. These rising expenses, known as health inflation, make it difficult for the NHS to improve services and outcomes, even with more resources. This presents an issue, as in order to provide a good level of care for an increasingly ageing population, the NHS needs to invest in the long-term future, but currently there isn't enough money for this. Even though funding has increased, this is being used to cover the increased maintenance costs of the service, which have surged over the last decade, meaning there is little to no money left over to invest in the long-term capacity of the NHS, and money needs to be redirected to cover the daily operational costs. This underinvestment in the NHS is part of a broader pattern of inadequate infrastructure spending across the UK. Sectors including transportation and public services also suffer from underfunding, leading to inefficiencies and reducing service quality. New projects are also significantly harder and more expensive to build in the UK than in other countries, and nowhere is this better shown than with HS2. This was a proposed high-speed rail network to better connect North and Southern England. Ignoring the fact that these rail networks already exist, the project was first conceived in 2009, and taking 11 more years to begin construction in 2020, by which time the proposed costs of construction had ballooned from 37 to over £100 billion. All of this only for it to be abandoned in 2023. An issue which has made many of the existing issues in the UK worse is of course Brexit. Brexit and its effects have been multifaceted and could easily take up a whole video on itself. And while the decision by the UK public to leave the European Union in 2016 has undoubtedly made the UK worse off than it was before, namely through a reduction of trade with the UK's largest trading partner, the EU, it's not the sole reason for Britain's economic decline, as many of the hardships currently being faced by Britain are also present in other European economies, and Britain's current brain drain crisis is caused by a whole host of other factors, namely the desire for new opportunities and a higher quality of life. Turning back to the country's favourite decade, the focus on immediate economic gains during the 1990s often came at the expense of long-term infrastructure planning and investment. Although privatisation was meant to bring in capital for infrastructure upgrades, in many cases it led to underinvestment, as private companies sought to maximise profits rather than reinvest in long-term improvements. And now the UK is paying the price. And even with the potential of a changing government in the general election, it doesn't look like things will get better for a number of years.